First of all, I would like to start off by thanking everyone for coming today and being a part of this new tradition for the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications. Today's program has two parts. First, remarks and awarding of our national citation to an outstanding journalist, and second, recognizing our students who are receiving awards and scholarships. It's incredibly special to have one of the best journalists in the country here today to receive an award a few years after he graduated, and then to honor our current students. So this is a new tradition. So if there are a few glitches, just bear with us. But we decided last year to move William Allen White Day to April. First of all, so that our donors and trustees could meet the outstanding students who benefit from their generosity, and we also thought the weather might be a little bit better than early February. So I think we made the right decision to bring these two special events together because this week the weather has been beautiful, absolutely perfect. And although our campus is lovely any time of year, it is especially beautiful in the spring. So let's begin by honoring our returning student and speaker. We are especially proud to honor him today, not only because of all the impressive contributions that he has made to the field of journalism, but also because he is one of our own, a Jayhawk journalist. And he will be introduced this afternoon by another one of our distinguished alumni, Professor Emeritus Bruce Linton. Dr. Linton built the broadcasting department in the school and served as the director of the radio and television program from 1955 until 1984. He retired from teaching in 1988. He's also served as the head of the Association of Broadcast Education and is the recipient of numerous awards for broadcasting and wrote a history of broadcasting at KU. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Linton to the stage. Bruce?
Well, I'm delighted to be here, to have this privilege of introducing Bob Dotson. When I started putting my remarks together, I thought, well, I might loosen things up a little bit. You know, expose some juicy things about Bob when he was a student here. But that wasn't going to work for two reasons. One, the realistic one, is that professors don't know that much about their students. And the other is, I'm too old, I can't remember. Well, I do remember that Bob came in 1964 to KU. At that time, and I have to read some of this because I can't remember it anymore either. At that time, we had quite an operation in radio, TV, film. We called it RTVF, and it was possible to emphasize it in either journalism or actually speech and drama. If you wanted to go to speech and drama, that was because you wanted to perform or do something of that nature. But in journalism, it was news or marketing, sales, you know, the whole bit there. So Bob was interested in going through journalism. Our labs were in Hoke Auditorium. Not what you see today, of course. That left some years ago. The facade is still there on the front. But there was a stage, and we had our TV on the stage, and then we had we called it KUOK, the student radio station. It was in the basement, and so was film editing and a few other things. But that was the way that it went, and we had full faculty supervision of the student radio station, which incidentally is the same station that's here on the floor, third floor of this building in KUJH. When it went to an actual legal broadcasting company broadcasting station in 1975 or so. Well, KUK was a good experience for Bob. It enabled him to work in news, I think, some of the things we gave him. And he did it at KANU, a station that still exists. And he also did some work at KMBC and TV in Kansas City. In those years, we gave annual awards to TV people, radio people, our students, And I want to tell you, give you an idea of what Bob did as a student here. 1966 and 67, he received the Outstanding Merit Award for his work on KUOK. Also in 1967, he received an award for his work in news. This was named for a very famous newsman and KU grad, Richard Harkness. Many of you oldsters would remember that name. In the same year, he was the outstanding junior student in RTVF through journalism. In 1988, his last year, Bob was named an outstanding senior in RTVF through journalism, and it turns out that he was doing very well, but he was just getting started. He went on to Syracuse University and got a master's degree in television and film. And then he got a job with an NBC affiliate in Oklahoma City. And so he traveled all the way back to, I guess, home surroundings, meaning the Midwest. And there he found a young lady named Linda, and they got married. So maybe that was one of the best things that happened in Oklahoma City. He was the director of special projects for the station. The more direct tie to NBC News, and he had this long time with them, came in 1975 when he was hired in Cleveland to work in news. 2 years there, and then off to Dallas, where he opened the NBC News Bureau, while also covering, would you believe, Central America. Then, still with NBC, there were stops in Atlanta and eventually New York. With NBC Productions, his film, El Capitan's Courageous Climbers, won 7 international film and video festivals, winning the Cine Grand Prize. He was a writer and host of Bob Dotson's America, a series of half-hour programs on the Travel Channel. Somewhere in these years, I think Bob found his niche. I've forgotten to ask him just when that was, but it happened. The basic idea was this, to quote Bob, "I look for the kind of guy who may never run for mayor or go to the moon or transplant a heart, but whose story may touch a viewer's heart." It wasn't easy to find these people. To quote NBC media bio, quote, "He's been around in more hotel rooms than the Gideon Bible, crisscrossing the country practically nonstop for 40 years, searching for people who would have this extraordinary skill or whatever it might be." And then once he found them, he had to research it. He had to write it. He had to produce it. Produce a program that would make the person and the extraordinary things really interesting for a television viewer. That's no easy task, believe me. Perhaps this is his special gift, that he can do that. I have no idea how many hearts that were touched by those programs. I think he's touched many of them, but the number has to be huge. And I do know that he's received over 100 awards for the outstanding quality of his work in broadcast journalism. For example, would you believe 8 national Emmys? The Society of Professional Journalists cites him 3 times for Best Network Television News Series. Got to turn the page. The Radio, TV, Television Digital News Association awarded him a record 5 Edward R. Murrow Awards. The National Press Association, Photographers Association, awarded him its highest honor with photojournalism, the Sprague Memorial Citation. Most of Bob's professional work has been spent in writing and producing program materials for television. But there's another area, print. Somehow he's found time to write several books. repeating his life work, relating to it. I have his second one, Make It Memorable, and it really is a textbook. I think he's a teacher as well as a reporter. His latest one, American Story, A Lifetime Search for Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things, is a New York Times bestseller. Now, his literary works have won the Christopher Award for Outstanding Nonfiction in 2014 and the George Washington Honor Medal for Excellence. I can hardly wait to read that book. And I can't wait any longer to hear what Bob has to say. So, ladies and gentlemen, may I present a journalist extraordinary, Bob Dotson.
I got it. 91 years young. And don't believe him when he says that he didn't know any of the kids. Our place was so small in those days, I had to graduate with a degree in speech and drama. And it was Dr. Linton who figured out how to make that bridge and be able to walk across the street to the enemy, the Daily Kansan, and say, maybe you ought to give this guy a shot and learn a little something about journalism too. Thank you. He touched my heart, and I hope he touched yours. I'm wearing a little pin on my suit, and it's from my grandfather. He graduated from the law school here in 1910. At the time, he was the only person in our family for over a century who went to college. My grandfather used to drag me down to the front of the law school before football games because I spent summers in Hiawatha, Kansas, and the rest of my life I grew up in the big city of St. Louis. And he'd say, "You see that statue out front?" I'd say, "Yes, sir." "That's Uncle Jimmy Green. He was the first dean of the law school. I knew him before he was a statue. And you ought to go to school here." My grandmother was a little nonplussed when I moved into journalism, however. She thought I was going to be a lawyer like my grandpa. I came here to study pre-law. And then I found KUOK. And it all changed. And it wasn't until years later when I actually got on a network program that she could see what I did for a living. And I had a piece that was on the Today Show. And of course, I was so thrilled, I called her in Hiawatha and I said, "Grandma, did you see that story?" "Well, of course." "What'd you think?" Long pause. "You ought to learn a trade." "A trade? Yeah, they're not going to pay you for 2 minutes work a day. You will starve to death." She lived to be 94, and it was our running joke for years. I'd call her on Fridays and I'd say, "I got another paycheck, Grandma." "Fooled him again, did you?" So both of them, I wish they, and they probably are, watching me today. Because when Ann Brill, the dean, called me last year and said that they had voted me this honor, I thought she was calling because I had overdue books. It completely floored me. And I remembered that my grandmother said it probably wouldn't hold this job. And yet here I am in my 40th year with NBC News at 68, and they've taken me from a red-headed, freckle-faced kid to gray. 4 million miles in this country, crisscrossing back and forth, on a simple idea. Maybe that big media mirror that reflects power and celebrity has someone standing behind it who is important. I just got back from like a month overseas talking to people about the American story, and I was really floored once again that anybody cared overseas until a professor from Berlin wrote me and he said, "Did you know the United States was settled by 198 different nationalities?" And I thought maybe a dozen, but no, 198. And he said they came to the shores either as immigrants or slaves, and they fought 562 native tribes. And as we all know, it was a messy, messy history. But they created the United States of America. They created opportunity. And by the way, do you know that on any given Tuesday you can probably go down to the Dunkin' Donuts and not get firebombed? He says, you have had a unique career in that you study the quiet Americans who make that happen. Not necessarily power or celebrity, not certainly our politics, which prefers gridlock to compromise. And every day our journalists talk about the fading middle class and all of the problems that we have. And it would be like if all of us were journalists in a car and the right front tire went flat, we would beat each other to our iPhones to tweet the fact that the right front tire was flat. And maybe 6 weeks later we'd come back and lament the fact that the right front tire is still flat. But meanwhile, over in the shadows, some quiet American has figured out how to solve a problem. I hit upon this idea because I was reading a little history the other day, and did you know that they figured out how to put toilets in houses 1,500 years before Jesus was born? On the Isle of Crete, a bunch of ordinary folks, probably called plumbers, figured out how to put a toilet in a house, right? And the only ones who picked up on it at the time were the Romans. And the Romans had indoor plumbing. But then a bunch of good old boys came down from the Middle East one day and sacked Rome. And we forgot to ask the people, how do you put toilets in houses? And the next time they put a toilet in a house was 1829, almost 3,000 years after they had already figured out how to do it. Well, that struck an idea in my head that maybe we ought to spend more time talking to our aunts and uncles and sisters and brothers and ancestors and less time chasing Kim Kardashian. Because maybe these other people have an idea. Names we don't know, but should know, are why our country not only survives, but thrives. Where my daughter and her husband and our grandkids live in Brooklyn, there's a bus on the B68 line that goes down towards Coney Island, and it passes a McDonald's, which is owned by a Palestinian, and the general manager keeps kosher because he's an Hasidic Jew. Most of the clientele are first-generation immigrants from Pakistan and India, and the Ukraine and Russia. Back home, some of their relatives are at each other's throats. In Brooklyn, they're on each other's soccer teams. So what that professor in Berlin asked me actually started to ring true. Maybe the study of seemingly ordinary people is why this country moves forward, and they might have already solved things like putting toilets back in houses, but because we've gone at several generations now where we don't have active journalism, asking these seemingly ordinary people, what blueprint have you found to get beyond the well-documented challenges and shortcomings of our country on a day-to-day basis? One of them that I met in a very early age was a janitor in a railroad station just over the Kansas line. And he told me one day, sitting in a coffee shop, about a fellow named Paul Sykes who lined up with 600 ex-slaves on the Oklahoma line waiting for free land in Oklahoma. And he got as far as El Reno, Oklahoma, and he was joined by hundreds of nationalities and Native Americans who were trying to find some piece of the American dream. But it was too late to plant, too cold to plow, and they were going to starve to death because the opening was not until April. So he said this man named Paul Sykes went down to the Rock Island Railroad Station because there were 7 trains coming south from Wichita and 7 trains coming north from Dallas every day, and he started to sing, "The old ox a-moving, moving, moving. The old ox a-moving, it's moving right along. And the people on the train, they laughed at him. But occasionally they would throw out some quarters and nickels, dimes, what have you. And he took that money, he bought food, and he set out to cook dinner for everybody, not just the 600 ex-slaves, but everybody who was waiting for better times. He did that for 27 years. He was so caught up in doing it, he never even went out and tried to find his own piece of land. The old man telling me this story, he kind of had a face that looked like the western edge of Montana and a voice like a bugle, and he obviously told this story many times in the coffee shop, and no one was paying any attention to him except me. And he said, you know, I was an illegal immigrant too. I'm British from Wales, and I jumped ship in Galveston, and I ended up in Oklahoma, and I got a job as a janitor, and life was pretty good, and here comes the First World War. I decided, well, I owed something to America, so I enlisted in the old Rainbow Division, and I went over to France, and I was wounded, and I was on a troop train coming back to Le Havre, and I was ready to come home. And my bunkmate was a French officer, and he said, where are you from? And he said, America. He says, your accent doesn't sound like America. And he said, it's all right, everybody in America's got an accent. He said, what part of America? And he said, El Reno, Oklahoma. And he said, the Frenchman's eyes got real big, and he went, ah, the black man. Does he still sing and dance on the railroad platform? And so Sidney Klein Church, the man telling me the story, said, my eyes got big. And I said, yeah, how do you know about him? He said, well, when I was a little boy, my dad was an international salesman. And one summer he took me all the way around America. And the thing I remember the most was that old man in the long black coat and the derby hat singing the old Arcs a Movin', waiting for better times. Well, I decided that these are the kinds of stories that were the most underreported in America. Stories about us. You know, like they said, people who don't necessarily run for president, not going to write a book, don't tweet, they're too busy solving problems. Most of what I've done on television is a little like tossing darts into smoke, and it soon drifts away, but the blueprints that I found from these individuals lingered. Like, for instance, our most recent national park, the Lewis and Clark National Park, was developed by a guy who was a nature photographer, and he found out stuff that historians had overlooked for 200 years. For instance, he said, you know, our first truly democratic election was on the Lewis and Clark expedition. I said, how did that happen? He said, well, you know, this 19-year-old mother with a baby on her back led all these guys who were like Navy SEALs over the top of the Rocky Mountains and down to the coast. But they got on the Columbia River, and he says, I started to wonder, because I was reading the histories, and they were making like 30 miles a day, and they got to about where Portland is, and it took them 6 weeks to go across the river from the Washington State side to the Oregon side. He says, so I started reading more in depth. And it turns out that they got there just before the Russians, or just after the Russians had gotten there, and the Russians had bought all the food from the local Indians. And so the Lewis and Clark expedition said, well, where do we go? And the Indians said, well, you got to go over there to Oregon. They didn't call it Oregon, but they said, you got to go across the river. And they tried day after day and kept sinking their canoes. So they decided, and now this is part of the national park, to let everybody have a vote. Lewis and Clark had one black guy on the trip with him, a slave. So they let him vote, because if they're going to die, you might as well let him vote. And they let Pocahontas vote. And he says, as far as I can tell, that's the first time that there was an election that included everybody around. And now the Coast Guard sends their ships out there, because where the Columbia River goes into the Pacific Ocean, in fact, other Coast Guards from around the world do, they send their ships out there for training. But they finally got to the other side, and he got the national park, because he kept bringing up all this stuff. In fact, he figured out where Lewis and Clark actually saw the Pacific, and they made that part of the national park because all the historians have been wrong for 200 years. And he was the son of mother and father who were loggers, and so he would look at all the tidal charts and all that, and he figured it out. Okay, so all of his friends called and emailed and said, you know, he's not even invited to the unveiling. The president's going to be there, the governor's going to be there, Coca-Cola's going to be there, everybody's there, power and money, it's all there. So I called him and he said, well, that's by design. If I were coming to stand up next to the president, this never would have happened. Yeah, he says, nothing gets done right besides unless you find power and money. But he said, I have no power and no money. All I have is the fact that I did it. But if I stand up next to the guys who live and die to get their picture on the Today Show and the front page of the Lord's newspaper, then I would be a symbol of their lie. They didn't do anything except show up with, the elected officials and do it. So they will back away. He says, I decided to attack this problem as I would if I were teaching my young daughter, Rebecca, how to ride a bike. Once I got the training wheels on, and she starts wobbling off across the church parking lot, the training wheels, power and money, I would never think of running alongside and yelling to the neighbors, hey, look what Dad did. He taught Rebecca how to drive the bike. Because, of course, Rebecca would never ride the bike again. He says, the way to get power and money attached to your idea or project is to stand in the shadows and applaud. So here was a terrific story on the surface, our most recent national park and this guy who did it, but I included in the story the blueprint, because you could take that to the Kiwanis Club, you could take that to the PTA, you could take that to the condo meeting, and what a seemingly ordinary person had figured out about how to get things done becomes very, very important. So I found a few things when I was writing this most recent book. They said, well, you can't just do all of your old war stories because only 5 people will read it, and they'll only read it to see if they're named. And once they realize that you didn't mention them, they're not going to read it anyway. Probably won't even buy it. So they said, what have you learned? Sounds like Dr. Linton. What have you learned from all of this for 40 years? And I went, not much. I got Alzheimer's. I can't remember anything. But the more I thought about it, despite our headlines, Americans who thrive and their communities that thrive embrace differences. Now, everybody's going to say, yeah, Bob, nobody embraces differences. You got Ferguson, you got this, you got that. Absolutely. We got all of that. But then we've also got a guy who was an illegal immigrant who's now one of the foremost cancer researchers in the world at Johns Hopkins. And he has invited people from all over America from totally different backgrounds who are brilliant but are totally different to be on his committee because he says, if everybody came from Lawrence, Kansas, you'd get stumped. Because when you run into a problem, we all think the same. But if you bring people who are brilliant but from lots of different backgrounds to attack a problem, we'll get it solved. And you look back at American history over and over again, sure, there are the Fergusons, there's the Civil Wars, there's all these well-documented and terrible things that have happened, but there are also people who have figured out how to embrace differences, and out of differences, they've come to a better idea of how to solve a problem. Secondly, I think the reason America works is that we're pioneers. The ones that weren't pioneers stayed home. The ones that were brought here in slavery decided, I'm not staying in Alabama, I'm coming to Oklahoma and Kansas. I'm going to try again. Pioneers. Part of that is their willingness to explore, despite all of the challenges. People come to America, immigrants come to America, not because they think the world is painted with gold bricks here in America. That was another generation. They come with their eyes open, but they also know that they have opportunities if they explore. And Americans who embrace differences say, I don't really care if you get on the wagon with me to go to the Oregon Trail as long as you know how to change a wheel, because we're going to get there. And time and again, that's what happens. They also value teamwork. I went out to a little place called Phillipsburg, Montana recently because somebody said they put on 3 operas a year that they write themselves, and there are only 900 people in this town. And when I did a little research, I realized that there were 29 ghost towns around Phillipsburg. It's up in this beautiful part of the mountains, about 28 years south of Helena. I mean, you just drive to Middle Age and turn right, and then you hit there, So I thought, okay, how can a town with 900 people have 3 original operas a year, have figured out how to keep their hospital open by opening up a swap shop? And so if you have a shirt that you've worn a little bit and you want to sell, and normally it would go for 50 cents, they'd sell it for like $20, Everybody's willing to pay the $20 because the 1950 goes to the hospital. So now they have doctors and their hospital's still open. Then they open up the schools. Rather than have their kids go 200 miles a day round trip or go to boarding school, they opened up the schools. And that was a great thing for the superintendent because he was offered a big job in Helena and decided, well, maybe I really love this little town. I mean, it's close to everything I like. And it's filled with pioneers. This was the first place that everyone beat everyone else in Montana to the silver mines in Phillipsburg. And when the silver mines disappeared and boomed and busted, they stuck around. They figured out ways to make a living, even though there's nobody there with a lot of money. That superintendent of schools came down with a brain tumor at 42. And he tells the tale. He said, I was out fishing before we were going to drive to the hospital. And I was worrying because we didn't have enough insurance. I came downtown after fishing, and a big tent had been put up over Main Street, and all of my neighbors were there, and they handed me a $40,000 check. What if I'd taken that job up in Helena? 9 years later, his daughter, Sydney, comes down with cancer. And these 900 people did it again. They came up, this was in the Great Recession recently, with $100,000. And of course, when I asked them, why, how'd you do it? And they said, well, we're just good neighbors. And I'm going, yeah, right. 100 grand, 40 grand. And one fellow who was a rancher summed it up and he said, this is the last best place. It has to survive. And he says, we didn't do it for the superintendent or his family. We did it for us. If we didn't save us, there would be no town. And I said, well, how'd you do it? Because I'm into blueprints now, Doc. I want to know. He says, well, it was very simple. He says, I bought a cattle chute the other day for $14,000, and I used it for a year, and I knew one of my neighbors needed a cattle chute, and I said, I'll sell it to you for $25,000. And I'll take the $14,000, actually less than that because it's a year old, and everything else will go towards making sure that little girl lives. And so everybody kind of dug down, but they got something out of it, human nature, so that they could get it done. And he says, you come to this town now, and you're thrilled because it's beautiful. We got a lot of tourists that come in the summertime. Architecture's wonderful. We painted it all up. But he says, that's not the town. The town are the people. That's why we're not a ghost town. So in the 21st century, America still has its pioneers. One of the last things I learned was that Americans keep their promises. Successful, ordinary, seemingly quiet Americans keep their promises. There's a little company just outside of Boston that is the oldest American company. It dates back to 1326. It started in Turkey, and the family, this is a family-owned business, made gongs. And finally, along about the 11th or 12th generation, they got sick of the gongs, and this guy came to the United States and wanted to work in a chocolate factory, but the family got to him and said, all right, okay, I'll open up a gong factory in the United States. 2 weeks later, the Great Depression started. Everybody's laying off everybody. Mr. Zildjian decides he'll look around Boston, he'll find the best workers for his assembly line, and he said, I'll give you a promise. You take care of my family, I'll take care of yours. And so he opened the Zildjian Gong Factory in 1929, and they have never had a layoff. Now, how'd he do it? He said, well, I'll tell you what, folks, if you don't mind when we have automation or changes being retrained, I always have room for a human brain to help solve another problem in my company. So as long as you can be retrained and are willing to do it and work any hours that we need to get done, that'll be fine. The other thing I want to ask you for is never to work harder or faster or produce more. I want you to produce it right the first time. Because he says the average American product that is shipped out is right only 75% of the time. And I want to be right 98% of the time. And then he started talking to people who actually might use a gong, and that included a lot of jazz musicians that no one was talking to because they were almost invisible in 1929 to the larger society. And he says, how can I help you? And they said, well, if you take that gong and you put two of them together and call it a hi-hat, that might work. Well, he invented all the symbols that we use today. The Beatles started using Zildjian. All the big bands started using Zildjians. Jazz musicians, classical musicians. And then he started asking technology people, saying, listen, why don't we put all the symbols in a room and turn a button, and that way you will hear what it sounds like in the Hollywood Bowl, and turn it again, and that was what it sounded like at the Ramada Inn out here on Jayhawk Boulevard. So you know exactly what you're going to get before you get it. And then everybody on the assembly line has to sign off on everything individually before they move it on down the line. I met a guy named George Plakis, an immigrant from Greece, who started out pulling gongs from one side of the assembly line to the other in a wagon. He has been retrained 8 times. He is 72 years old. He is now part of quality control, listening to what the symbols sound like. He has 2 daughters who are both in medical school, and he's had a middle-class income all these years. They are debt-free. 75 people on the assembly line and another 25 people who sell it, and they have 92% of the world market. They have never outsourced anything. They haven't laid off anybody since 1929. Heck, that could send the business school to lunch, couldn't it? I mean, really. How did they do it? Well, and so, I was talking to the people from the bottom up, and so I started talking to the people from the top down. First time they've ever had 2 women in charge. Family members, CEO and the president, both women. And they said, well, we've had a family tradition since 1326. You never hire the spouse. No spouses in this business. And if you are a granddaughter or a grandson, you must go to college. You must graduate from college. And then you have to go out and find your own job on any kind of operation that has nothing to do with music or symbols. And you must be successful in that job for 5 years. And then you can come talk to the rest of the family about getting a job at Zildjian. The last piece that I learned from the backyard. And I learned it right here at KU. Of course, my grandfather was thrilled that I graduated, right? You can imagine. And my grandmother was like, hey, you got a job. I know he's kind of wonderful. But my dad took me out to have coffee the morning of the graduation ceremony, and he mentioned that he did not go to college. And I said, I knew that. And he said, I never got past the 5th grade. I said, Dad, you've got a company, Dotson Optical Company. You've got an honorary master's of ophthalmics on the wall. He said, I went 26 years to night school. I said, why didn't you go to college? He said, my father left when I was 10, joined the Army, and never came back, leaving my mother with 3 kids to raise and no extended family in St. Louis. And he says, it wasn't unusual in those days, because I was born in 1905, so by 1915, if you didn't have an extended family, you sent the oldest son out to a farm or a ranch, and they became an indentured servant. And whatever money they made, it came back to Mom to be able to raise the other kids. He says, so off I went. And he says, I was there for a year, and one day my aunt showed up with my uncle, who was a cop. And they buggy whipped the farmer and threw me in the back of a wagon and took me back to St. Louis. And on the way back, they said, the farmer's been steaming open the letters that we send you and taking dollar bills out. But we've got a job for you. There's a wooden auto body plant, and they need somebody small to be a janitor to run up underneath the assembly line and sweep up the wood shavings. He says, it was the loneliest year of my life, age 11, and all of the people working on the assembly line were first-generation immigrants, and none of them spoke English. So they're all adults, and they're speaking Italian and German. And then I went to become a janitor in an optical store. And the man who owned the optical store said, Bill, I'll never ask you to work nights. You might want to consider going to school. 26 years later. He had come from janitor to manager of 2 of these optical stores, and then I was born, his second son. And he figured, I got to make something of myself. So he took his $140 savings in 1946, and he read that there was a grinding stone for sale in Kansas City. He had enough money for a train ticket to Kansas City. He was too proud to talk to the relatives in Kansas City to spend the night, so he got this grinding stone, kept it on his lap, got on the train, came back, and started Dotson Optical with a partner. That Christmas, the partner went to Mexico with all the money. I took a sip of coffee. What'd you do? I started again. And then what happened? In October, you got polio, and you couldn't walk, and you couldn't put your heel down until you were 8 years old, and you were 2 at the time. What'd you do? I started again. Well, you see, when you don't ask people in the backyard, you miss, I think, the real story of America. It's not the absence of challenge. It's not all our shortcomings, although what we do is travel as journalists in herds and pounce on problems to repeat over and over and over again without a glimmer of solution, because we're not asking people who might have the solution. That grandpa of mine is the reason I became a storyteller. Because after dinner in Hiawatha, Kansas, we'd go out on the front porch and we'd rock. And most older people will tell you stuff like, I went to KU, and then I joined the Army, and I was the president of the Kiwanis Club, and my grandfather would say things like, I'm 8, right? Did I ever tell you about my honeymoon? No. Well, we went to Salt Lake City. And at 8, I figured out, well, why the hell would you go to Salt Lake City? I had a free ticket. I'd done some work for the Union Pacific, and so I was on the train. And he said, we were in the cafe car, your grandma and I, and the conductor came up to me, and he said, are you Paul Bailey from Hiawatha, Kansas? I said, yeah. I'm your oldest brother, the one you haven't seen in 20 years. My grandfather was the last of 10 kids, so he must have been like a tiny baby when all these people went west to find their fortune. Turns out this guy had gone to Minnesota, and he was trying to get a job on the railroad, and of course the primary ethnic group in Minnesota was Norwegian or Swedish, so he changed his name from Bailey to Baileyson. And he got a job. And his step-up job was as a conductor on the Union Pacific. My grandfather had a penny postcard that he showed me. This was sent back to the mom in Ohio, and it's like the perfect tweet. It showed my grandmother and grandfather floating on their backs in the Great Salt Lake, you know, with those big old spaghetti strap swimsuits and the hats and all that, with the brother, who's probably taken a couple of days off from the railroad. Big red circle around the brother. The postcard is addressed to the mother. Now imagine if you get this, and it said, Ma, we found Vance. More later. Well, my career is the more later. I'm convinced of that. And that's why I've spent my entire career looking at an address list of long forgotten names and trying to spend some time with them, not just to get their stories, not to do good news. I'm not Jerry Falwell. I could care less about faith-based stuff in news. I want to do an investigative report on a seemingly ordinary person because they may have some solutions that will handle problems that we face today. They might have figured out how to put the toilet back in a house. And so I spent my entire career doing that. And I want to leave you with just one thing. The shortest distance between two people is a good story. Once you know my story and I know yours, I know not only how we differ, but I start to understand how we're alike. And remember, despite what I'm wearing, wisdom doesn't always wear a suit. Thank you.
I'm Susan Lynn, and I have the privilege to be this year's president of the William Allen White Foundation. Bob.
Thank you.
Recipients of the William Allen White Foundation Citation Award are professional journalists who have made notable contributions to an informed public and who have won broad acclaim and respect at a national level from their peers over a significant period of time. On behalf of the William Allen White School of Journalism and Mass Communications and the William Allen White Foundation, I present the National Citation Medallion to journalist, author, and storyteller, Bob Dotson.